Is the Linux desktop in trouble? Linus Torvalds sees ChromeOS and Android as the future of Linux. Plus, the Linux Mint devs, they're not happy. A rare glimpse into the personal struggles that developers face. Have you had enough of Windows 10 hassles? Well, one author shares his reasons why you should abandon Windows for Linux. China could soon ban crypto mining, citing a waste of resources. Is this China being China? Are they right on this? I actually think China may be the voice of reason in these sick and corrupt times regarding this. Also, Microsoft in the Linux news. Microsoft has released VS Code as a snap, and Microsoft doesn't rule out Edge for Linux. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is an article over at ZDNet. The Linux desktop is in trouble. This was written by Stephen J. Von Nichols, and because of the title is a bit of clickbait, right? The Linux desktop is in trouble, and because of that, I've seen a lot of discussion all over the internet, all over social media, on YouTube, on Reddit, Twitter. Well, I don't have Twitter, but I'm sure there's plenty of discussion going on over on Twitter about this particular article by Stephen J. Von Nichols. Linus Torvalds looks to Chromebooks and Android for the future of the Linux desktop, while Linux Mint devs aren't happy with each other. So basically, Stephen J. Von Nichols is talking about some of the struggles going on right now as far as desktop Linux and desktop Linux becoming adopted by the masses. So Stephen J. Von Nichols, he goes on to write that Microsoft is more and more looking like they're moving Windows to a desktop as a service kind of model, probably eventually maybe offering a subscription model for their desktop. But again, it's basically you renting this desktop as a service rather than actually owning and having complete control of your own desktop operating system. According to Stephen here, Linux will be the last traditional PC desktop operating system standing. I think he's right. Actually, I think we're probably already that. We're probably already the only real desktop operating system left standing. But that doesn't mean that Stephen is blind to some of the problems of Linux. He mentions that in a recent interview, Linus Torvalds was quoted as, quote, "Chromebooks and Android are the path toward the desktop," unquote. Now, what does Linus mean here? Well, he means basically that the Google operating systems, their Linux operating systems, ChromeOS and Android, are a little easier to work with because one company basically controls that. It's very standardized, right? Where we do not have a standardized Linux desktop. And it goes so much deeper than just the desktop. Most people focus on the desktop, like the desktop environment and things like that. That's not really what we're talking about. But even like the core fundamental utilities, like the base packages on your typical GNU/Linux distros, they vary. They vary from distro to distro, and it makes really getting this thing adopted by the masses that much more difficult when there's no real standard. There's no Linux standard. Of course, one of the defining features of every Linux distribution is package management. There's no standard with package managers. For one thing, pretty much every Linux distro has their own package manager. I mean, we have, apt in the Debian and Ubuntu families. We have Pacman and the Arch family. Emerge with Gentoo and its family, DNF and Fedora and Zipper and SUSE and Equo and Sabian and so forth and so on. I could name a dozen others. And then we haven't even gotten into the so-called universal package formats, the distro agnostic package formats, things like Flatpak, Snap, AppImage. There's more than one of those. So according to Linus Torvalds, he thinks there's been some progress, on this front. He actually does like Flatpaks. Me personally, I like Flatpaks, Snaps, and AppImages. I think they're great. But there is somewhat of a rivalry going on between Flatpak, which is developed by Red Hat, and Snap, which is developed by Canonical. It's not really a rivalry. Stephen J. Von Nichols in the article mentions there's a rivalry. I don't see it as that. I mean, it's a friendly rivalry if it's a rivalry, but they're not competing in that it's a zero-sum game. We can only have Flatpaks or we can only have Snaps. There's room to have more than one of these universal formats, and they're not identical in exactly what they do either. Same thing with app image, those that want to throw in app image into the discussion. But if you talk to certain members of the community, you would think there was a rivalry going on with these corporations, Red Hat and Canonical, and there's not. But if you go to Reddit or, social media of any kind, people, say that they really support Flatpak and that snaps are evil, or snaps are great and Flatpaks are evil. Or some people, Flatpaks and snaps are evil, app image is the way to go. And it's this kind of stuff that really, for the new to Linux user, somebody that's just learning about Linux, when they see the way our community kind of tears itself apart over trivial things, this is why we can't be adopted by the masses. Stephen J. Von Nichols goes on to mention that none of the major Linux distributions, or none of the major Linux distributors, Canonical, Red Hat, and SUSE being the big ones because they're the big corporations behind Linux, they're not really interested in Linux desktop. They're not really interested in the Linux desktop at all, to be frank. They make all their money in the server market. That's where Red Hat, Canonical, SUSE, that's where they make their money. They make their money with the servers, in the cloud, the Internet of Things, enterprise contracts. They really don't make any money on the Linux desktop, their desktop distributions, because there's no real way to monetize that. Canonical tried for years. Canonical tried for over a decade to become profitable as the one company to cater to the Linux desktop, and they never could make it work, and they were the only ones trying. Eventually, they had to pivot and get back into the server market, and in particular in the cloud market, where they're now making bucket loads of money. Von Nichols goes on to mention that not only is there a problem with the big corporations that are not really doing much with the Linux desktop, and there are a lot of small distributions. There's over 300 distros currently listed on distrowatch.com right now. And some of these smaller community distros, things like Linux Mint and Manjaro and MX, Elementary, Solus, they put out really good Linux desktop distributions. That said, they're really small Linux communities, and quite frankly, they are, quote, running on a shoestring basis, meaning they got no money. And some of these smaller communities are basically one guy getting hit by a bus, and these distros go away. We've already seen this. Solus is still there, but when Ike Doherty left Solus, it was in a lot of turmoil. We didn't get a major release of Solus for over a year because the main dev left. We saw the same thing with Void Linux. The Void Linux dev disappeared, and it took them a good year before they got back on track. Linux Mint, if they ever lost their main developer, Clem, it would probably be a major blow to Linux Mint for a long time. Same thing with Manjaro, MX. So it's tough for these community distros, even though they are very much focused on the desktop. Many of these smaller distributions, again, they're basically one illness or, one unfortunate death or, somebody going to jail from these distros disappearing. Stephen J. Von Nichols goes on to quote Clem, the main dev of Linux Mint. He is having some struggles right now. Him and the Linux Mint community are bickering about various things. I'm not actually going to hold off on this discussion for the second story on the docket tonight. In closing, Stephen J. Von Nichols mentions that looking ahead, he'd love to see a foundation bring together the Linux desktop community and have them hammer out a common desktop for everyone. Okay, well, first of all, we do have a Linux Foundation. It is not interested in the Linux desktop at all. It is all big corporate donors, basically, that all have a seat on the board of the Linux Foundation. And most of those companies, how do they make their money? They make their money really with Linux servers, IoT devices, and things like that. They really don't care about Linux on the desktop being, developed or anything. They're all worried about the Linux kernel, which they use for whatever products that they're putting out. So the Linux Foundation, it exists, but it's not really a foundation for the Linux desktop. I don't know if we could ever have one. Also, he mentions that, Stephen J. Von Nichols wants a common desktop for everyone. No. That's ridiculous. That's never going to happen. This is the free and open source software community here. Free, as in freedom, meaning I have the freedom to take whatever code that's out there under a free license, and I can modify it, configure it, redistribute it, rename it, fork it, create whatever I want out of it. And you do have that same freedoms. We all have that same freedom with these projects that are licensed under a free license. Because we have that freedom, we're going to exercise it. So the idea that we're all going to work on a common desktop for everyone, never going to happen. And Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols mentions, although he'd like to see that happen, it's not going to happen. So he recognizes that's impossible. And Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols goes on to mention that our Linux desktops, basically, we would be more commercially successful with the Linux desktop if we didn't have this current hodgepodge of all these different distributions, different desktop environments and window managers. Basically, that would mean, a lot more Linux desktop developers could make a living for their work because we start generating money. But then again, most of these people that are doing this work don't get into it to make money. A lot of free and open source software developers get into it for the love of just coding, right? They love programming, and they enjoy this as a hobby initially. Now, some of these snowball into more substantial projects, and it would be nice if some of these guys, could make a living with their projects. Unfortunately, the free and open source software community, sometimes we're not good at supporting those that so generously provide code, time, money, artwork, and everything that goes in to the software we use on a daily basis, and I think that's unfortunate. And the second story on the docket tonight is Linux Mint's sobering update. There is a rare glimpse into the personal struggles that developers face. This article comes from Forbes.com, written by Jason Evangelo, who's doing some really good coverage of Linux over at Forbes.com. So, much like the Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols article that we just covered that briefly touched on the problems that the Linux Mint devs have been facing the last couple of weeks, this article is also going to focus on that subject. So Jason here mentions that he read the monthly news update from the Linux Mint team leader, their lead dev, Clem Lefebvre, and it's a sobering experience. While users do get updated on the status of Linux Mint 19.2, basically this monthly news update was all about, upcoming Mint releases, but Clem, the lead dev, did go into some of the frustrations, uncertainty, defeat that he has been feeling regarding Linux Mint development these past few months. So Jason goes on to say that a lot of people have commented about that post from Clem. A matter of fact, we just saw Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols commented on it. Several authors in various publications have commented about Clem's statements in that monthly news update, and most of them saw it as a kind of a doomsday kind of scenario. Clem's getting frustrated, burnout, Linux Mint is in trouble. Jason Evangelo sees it as a bit of a different take here. He says, while other hot takes around the internet applied that this could lead to the project suffering or that the team as a whole is depressed, I disagree. There's an undertone of hope and confidence in Clem's blog post. So he sees, obviously Clem did kind of vent a little bit in the blog post, but he sees this as really a sign of hope and confidence. So let's actually discuss what Clem posted. Here is a brief quote of Clem in that Linux Mint monthly news update. Quote, "We can have doubts. We can work really hard on something for a while and then question it so much we're not even sure we'll ship it. We can get motivated, demotivated, uncertain, depressed even by negative reactions or interactions, and it could lead to developers stepping away from the project, taking a break, or even leaving for good." So what he's talking about here, what was causing some of these frustrations was, you guys might remember 2 or 3 weeks back on Taking Into Account, I mentioned that the Linux Mint team was redesigning all of their artwork, their branding, their logo, doing a complete website redesign. And I covered some of the new design actually on Taking Into Account just a few weeks ago. And I personally thought the new design, the new logo looked great. I thought it was a refreshing update to what had become kind of a rather stale and kind of an old looking logo and design, and the website did not look modern, did not look fresh. And I really liked the new design that they went with. Well, a lot of the community did not. Some of the devs did not. And many of them had a very negative reaction, negative response to this. And of course, there was a lot of bickering and argument over it. And Clem took some of this, obviously, personally. Linux Mint, of course, is his baby. Jason Evangelo goes on to say that what Clem could be feeling, though, is what psychologists call imposter syndrome. It's not a disease or a disorder, but it is this psychological phenomenon that is experienced by successful people. So basically, you're really successful at something, and internally you sometimes start feeling like you're a fraud, that you're unworthy of your success despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And Clem has really been very successful as far as taking Linux Mint, which was just a fork of Ubuntu initially. A decade ago, they started Linux Mint really as Ubuntu with some proprietary codecs installed to make your life easier. That was before Ubuntu actually had the ability to add all your third-party drivers and video codecs and all that in the Ubuntu installer. Ubuntu used to only ship free software for the most part on its distro, so you had to go out of your way to get your proprietary NVIDIA driver and all those multimedia codecs. Well, Linux Mint just took Ubuntu, put all that in it, and that was how Linux Mint started, and then it just blossomed into something really unique. For one thing, obviously, Ubuntu eventually created its own desktop environment, Unity. Linux Mint went and created something else because they didn't want to go with Unity. They created, actually, Mate and Cinnamon. And really, Linux Mint is very much, even though it's Ubuntu based, it's really stands on its own now. And I guess, according to Jason, he thinks maybe because of the overwhelming success of the Linux Mint distro that maybe Clem is suffering from this imposter syndrome. I'm not sure of that. I think it may just be burnout. You know, sometimes you work on something for a long time. He's been working on Linux Mint for over a decade now. I don't know what he was working on prior to that, but I'm sure he puts in a lot of hours and spends a lot of time working on Linux Mint and has for many, many years now. It could just be the guy's tired. One interesting thing about the Clem blog post, the monthly news post that he did, was that Linux Mint plans on to start alpha testing, something they haven't done before. I think that is great. Quote, feedback is something we should love, not something we should fear. It's what fuels our project and our development. I agree. So they're going to start doing alpha testing for the Linux Mint releases so they can get more feedback, I guess, prior to a proper release. I think that's a good thing. And he's right. You should release your alphas. You know they're going to be full of bugs, but you want more eyes on those bugs. You want more people involved, and ultimately, it should create a better product in the end. Clem says that the Linux Mint beta period was starting to be so overwhelmed with bug reports. So they would do a beta, the beta right before the release, but they had so many bug reports that, you just couldn't manage them all. So now let's do an alpha first, and then a beta, and then, of course, the release. And I think that makes a lot more sense, in my opinion. I think that's the way most distros should do. Many of them do. Not all of them do. Canonical, oddly enough, with their main Ubuntu desktop, they only do a beta now. They don't do an alpha, although they do have a release, like the nightly builds, the development release that a lot of people are running, and I'm sure filing bug reports. All in all, though, I think this was just Clem, who normally doesn't do this. I think he's just tired, probably frustrated a little bit, probably just a little burnout. The guy probably just needs a bit of a vacation. But other than that, I don't think there's much to see here. He's been working on Linux Mint for over a decade. I'm assuming we're still going to have Clem working on Linux Mint for the next decade. And the third story on the docket tonight. Have you had enough of Windows 10 hassles? Well, this author gives you your reasons that you should abandon Windows for Linux. This comes from Matthew DiCarlo over at /gear. He writes, quote, had enough of Windows 10 hassles unless you plan to install Windows 7, which is going to lose support from Microsoft on January 14th, 2020. You guys need to write that down. Those of you still running Windows 7 machines, and I know some of the folks that are watching this still have Windows 7 installs. Guys, you're going to lose support January 14th, 2020. You have the rest of this year, but starting beginning of 2020, no more support for Windows 7. You need to start planning for your future if you're still on Windows 7, but even if you're on Windows 10, you know what? It's time. It's time for you to go ahead and make the switch. You probably don't have the extra cash to shell out for an Apple device. They're expensive, and even though they're expensive, and they typically are pretty stable, and you know they have a well-earned reputation for being stable pieces of hardware and software, but you're still denied the freedom that you deserve. Why not try a free operating system like Linux? The author goes on to write that the reason a lot of people are hesitant to make the switch from Windows to Linux is because there's a learning curve when you change platforms, right? You have to put in some effort. You're not going to move from Windows to Linux, or from Linux to Windows for that matter, or Mac to Linux, or whatever. You know, you're not going to change operating systems and know everything as soon as you get there. It's just not going to happen. You have to put in the time, put in the effort to learn your new operating system, and that scares most people, unfortunately. But let's get into this guy's reasons why every Windows user out there should abandon Windows for Linux. Number one, a curated software catalog like mobile platforms. So he's talking about an app store, basically. He's talking about our software repositories. Every Linux distribution has a repository. It is a central repository of software that is curated. Those packages have been checked, and those packages have been deemed safe for you to install. Matter of fact, because they're in the repo, they're endorsed packages by that distro, where on Windows, you really don't have a central repository. Yes, I guess on Windows 10, you have the Windows Store, but there's not that much stuff in it. For most of the software you want to get, you're probably going to have to go to a third-party, a proprietor's website, and download their version for Windows, that Windows executable version of that software, and then execute that, run through the setup, and hope that everything works. Hope there's no malware or anything in that. In Linux, we are really blessed to have these software repositories where 99.9% of what you want to install is probably going to be in your distro's repos. Something like Ubuntu, for example. It is very rare that you have to go to a third-party website and download a program to install on Ubuntu, because in Ubuntu, of course, all the free and open source software should be in Ubuntu's very large repos. But if you want third-party, proprietary, closed source software, the really big programs most people would want, things like Spotify, for example, they're available as a snap over at Canonical's Snap Store, which is also curated. So for privacy and security reasons, especially, the fact that we have repositories and Windows doesn't is a big reason you should abandon Windows for Linux. Number two, smoother update process for the OS and the software. I shouldn't have to go into detail about the Windows updates. It just updates when you want to. The updates sometimes are laggy. Sometimes they require several reboots. Sometimes they brick your machine. With Linux, the updates are usually very fast. They don't happen when you don't want them to. Even in something like Ubuntu. Ubuntu does have automatic updates, but you can tick that thing on and off. You decide whether you want Ubuntu to automatically update or whether you want to manage the updates yourself. You have complete control. You have control over nothing with Windows. Number three, highly customizable, especially the desktop interface. So, you want to change something about your desktop environment, you can do that in Linux, of course. In Windows, you can't really tweak the desktop very much. In Linux, you have probably 24 different desktop environments that you can choose from, like big desktop, full desktop environments that you can choose from if you want to install a different desktop environment than the one that got shipped with the distro that you're currently on. And if you want to go more minimal, window manager only, like I do, there's another 100 window managers, various window managers you could try. So extreme customization available in Linux. You can't customize really much of anything on Windows, certainly not on the Mac OS either. Number 4 here, more lightweight than Windows, less data extraction. So Linux just runs better than Windows. It's faster. Typically, we can run on much older hardware than Windows 10 will ever run on. So that is one of the big reasons, actually one of the main reasons a lot of people give Linux a try is because their Windows starts getting slow to the point it doesn't even run very well anymore. You know, the machine, that 5-year-old laptop that they're running Windows 10 on now, you know, it's just barely running, and it's frustrating. They're willing to give Linux a try at that point, and they're amazed when that laptop now runs like a new machine. Also, he mentions less data extraction. Obviously, there's spyware built into Windows 10. It's proprietary software, free and open source software, because we have these free and open source operating systems, these GNU/Linux distributions. There's no hidden spyware in there. Nobody's extracting your data. Linux is generally more secure and free forever. We really shouldn't have to dive too deeply into this. Linux is a more secure operating system than Microsoft Windows. I think most people would agree with that. It's free forever. It's free forever in the sense of freedom. So the operating systems like Ubuntu and Fedora and Debian and the various GNU/Linux distributions out there, most of them are licensed under, all of them are licensed under free licenses. Most of them licensed under the GPL, the GNU public license, or the general public license. And because of that, they're free forever. That source code is there for you to do whatever you want to do with that software. Nobody can ever take it away. Nobody can ever take it and do something else with it, slap a closed source proprietary license on it. It's free for you. For the next guy, if you want to distribute it to somebody else, it's free for them. Freedom, baby. Freedom. And some final thoughts about switching from Windows to Linux. While relearning a new operating system can be daunting, switching from Windows to Linux is more than doable with some dedication. And again, he's talking about, you know, you have to put in the time and effort if you want to switch operating systems. You know, it's not going to be something you just learn overnight. There's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be some awkward moments, especially initially. But he's right. It's very doable with some dedication. The author goes on to mention that no software is perfect, of course, and Linux is not perfect. It's going to have its own little quirks that may irritate you at first. But if you're concerned about Windows, if you're concerned about the privacy issues, especially, they're never going to get any better. They're only going to get worse. If you're concerned about security, Windows is probably never going to be more secure. It's always been an insecure operating system. Since the beginning, it's going to keep being insecure. If you're worried about it being bloated and slow, it's always been that way. You know, these things are never going to change with Windows. So don't think that these problems that are already frustrating you are going to get better with time. Go ahead, start planning ahead, and make the switch to Linux. And the fourth story on the docket tonight, I really had to throw this one in because I just thought this was one of the most amazing pieces of news I've read in a while. China could soon ban cryptocurrency mining, citing a wastage of resources. This comes from False Bytes. The Chinese government is soon expected to ban all crypto mining activities in the country. So, reading ahead here, it is suggested that the National Development and Reform Commission in China is considering the ban and is asking for public opinions on the revision of the guiding catalog for the adjustment of industrial structure. Basically, China is tired of all the crypto miners in China. China has a lot of population, but percentage-wise, they have a much bigger percentage of crypto miners than much of the rest of the world because energy is so cheap in China. It takes a lot of energy to crypto mine, and if you're paying high prices for that energy, crypto mining is not cost effective. Like here in the US, it's not really that cost effective for me to buy a bunch of really high-end video cards and start, putting them in these server racks and just crypto mining all day because of the amount of electricity I have to use, not to mention the heat generated, and then having to cool that room, unless I'm really making a lot of Bitcoin or Dogecoin, whatever crypto currency I'm mining for. It's just not cost effective. But in China, it is cost effective, and the Chinese government is about to put a stop to this. When the article mentioned the guiding catalog for the adjustment of industrial structure, basically this is this new catalog in China. They are cataloging 20 industries that basically they want to encourage, restrict, or eliminate. And crypto mining is among those. So Bitcoin mining has been added to the list of sectors that they want to abolish entirely, not just, slow it down or, a temporary ban. They want to abolish Bitcoin cryptocurrency mining entirely due to the environmental issues surrounding it. So mainly just the wasting of resources, the waste of energy, right? And the unsafe nature of the industry and non-compliance of laws and regulations. What they're talking about, non-compliance laws and regulations, of course, China, communist country, the fact that Bitcoin can be used to pay for things anonymously probably irritates the Chinese government quite a bit. As far as what I think about this, is this a good thing? Well, obviously, a communist government, putting such restrictions on its people. I don't like the fact that a lot of this probably does have to do with being able to pay for things anonymously, and I think that's a basic human right. I think everything should be able to be bought and paid for anonymously, no questions asked. That being said, the fact that the Chinese government wants to eliminate cryptocurrency mining, I think cryptocurrency mining is one of the biggest wastes that's going on in the world right now. The amount of energy spent mining cryptocurrency around the world is just ridiculous. And maybe I'm just not read up on the subject enough. Maybe I'm just not as informed as some of you guys, but I just don't see, how are we benefiting mankind mining for cryptocurrency? Are we really advancing the human race by all of the time and energy and effort into crypto mining? Not to mention, I don't like paying $800 for a video card that should cost me $400. I don't like paying $200 for RAM that should cost me $80. So I don't want cryptocurrency mining banned in the US, but the fact that China wants to ban cryptocurrency mining, I must say, it doesn't make me sad. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight is really two stories in one, but they both involve Microsoft in the Linux news. So, recently, Microsoft has announced that they're bringing Visual Studio Code, VS Code, to Linux as a snap pack. Some of you that have been using Visual Studio for a while on Linux say, hey, wasn't there always a snap available? There has been a snap, but this is actually an official snap, meaning Microsoft made that snap. It's not like a community snap that some guys are maintaining. So 2 days after releasing Visual Studio 2019 for Windows and Mac, Microsoft today made Visual Studio Code available for Linux as a snap. So they launched the free Visual Studio Code for Windows, Mac, and Linux in April 2016. That was when they first brought VS Code to Linux. But making the snap support finally brings more seamless auto updates for the Linux user, because with a simple sudo snap update, you get your snaps updated. So snaps, of course, developed by Canonical. They're one of those universal formats we talked about in one of the earlier stories. Basically a containerized software package that should work on every Linux distribution. Snaps are containers. They contain all the dependencies for the software, so you never have to worry about dependency problems. It's really good also for proprietary software, because proprietary software is not going to be in your distro's repos. Like the Ubuntu repos is not going to have proprietary software in it. So in that case, the only way to really get it is to provide it as a snap, a third-party snap package to install. So the community-created VS Code snap pack has been around since May 2017, but now you have the officially endorsed Microsoft Snap. And one of the guys that works on VS Code for Microsoft is quoted here, quote, "The automatic update functionality of snaps is a major benefit. It is clear there's a thriving community around snaps and that it is moving forward at a great pace. The backing of Canonical ensures our confidence in its ongoing development and long-term future." So Microsoft, they want to provide some kind of package for VS Code on not just Ubuntu, but all of Linux, and they see snaps as doing good work because it's backed by Canonical, and there's I don't know, thousands of snap packs right now, because really Ubuntu especially is getting to the point where they want pretty much all of their packages available as a snap. Not necessarily to replace apt as a package manager, but it's getting to the point where more and more of the built-in default applications on Ubuntu, like the system monitor and the calculator and things like that, are now installed as snap packs rather than as the packages that you got from apt at the command line. And there's a quote from one of the Canonical engineers as well. Quote, "Visual Studio Code is hugely popular, and it's fantastic that we're able to help it extend its reach into the Linux ecosystem." Basically, Microsoft VS Code. It's a really popular program. We're happy that all the folks, the tens of millions of people that run Ubuntu on the desktop, are now able to use Visual Studio Code. I think that's great too. I've been a little critical of Microsoft coming to Linux, doing so much with Linux in the last couple of years, but Visual Studio Code, from what everybody tells me, is a fantastic product. Of course, I prefer doing everything in Vim, but it is available to everybody on Linux, and I think them making the officially endorsed Snap Pack is a good thing. More Microsoft news. You guys might, those of you following the channel, remember a couple of weeks ago I did a video about Microsoft Edge, the Edge browser, possibly coming to Linux. I got some kind of criticisms about that, saying, oh, that's never going to happen. Maybe you're reading too much into it. Well, Microsoft actually did come out, somebody from Microsoft. So over on Twitter, somebody asked, is there support for Linux distros? And then one of the guys said, not yet. It's something we'd like to do eventually. Our build system runs on Linux, but we're taking things one step at a time, starting from Windows 10, and can't commit to Linux just yet. So we got to worry about our new Edge browser running on Windows 10 first, and then we'll worry about other operating systems. But he didn't rule it out. He didn't say, no plans for Linux at all. He just said, can't commit to it just yet. Matter of fact, he said that at the end of the post and at the beginning, not yet. And then at the end, just yet. So, could we get Microsoft Edge browser on Linux? It is a possibility. I'm not sure if it would be licensed under a free license. Currently, it's proprietary software, the Edge browser, so that may prevent a lot of people on Linux from adopting it. But that being said, Google Chrome is proprietary software, and Google Chrome has a massive amount of people using it on Linux, so what's the difference, right? And that was the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. This was Taking Into Account, episode 37. I try to release a new Taking Into Account every Thursday, so look for Taking Into Account episode 38 sometime next Thursday. As always, I try to end these episodes by reading a viewer question or comment. Typically, these viewer question or comments come from over on my Mastodon. If you're not following me on Mastodon, you really should. And I had several people comment over on Mastodon, also many YouTube comments as well. A video I made about a week or two ago was the big YouTubers, they get Linux wrong. Anytime any of the big YouTubers talk about Linux, they just do it a complete disservice. And the big YouTubers, I'm talking about the ones with millions and millions of subscribers. In particular, I mentioned Linus Tech Tips. I was very critical of a couple of videos he's done over the past 6 months covering Linux, because he just doesn't really know what he's talking about anytime he talks about Linux. And some of you guys were messaging me saying I was really hard on Linus, and that, hey, go easy on the guy. He's not a Linux user, and the fact that he's talking about it on this channel that gets tens of millions of views for every video, oh, be happy he's even talking about Linux. Also, he's got 30 or 40 people that work under him. Some of those guys probably know a lot about Linux. And, they got Linux servers, I'm sure, running in the offices and stuff. And, maybe he could learn more by talking to some of those guys. You know what? You guys do have a point, and I will say one thing. That Linus Tech Tips, I guess they heard the criticism, not just of me, but many people criticized Linus about those Linux videos, and they did a video just a few days ago. Microsoft should be very afraid, Noob's Guide to Linux Gaming. So Linus did a video about Linux gaming that was horrible. He couldn't install the video drivers in Ubuntu properly, and he couldn't get Steam and Proton working right. And, Linus himself just didn't know what he was doing. But the two guys that they got to do this video were very knowledgeable. One of the guys in the video, I think his name was Anthony, is a bigger guy, and he really knows his Linux. This was an awesome video, probably one of the best videos I've ever seen on the Linus Tech Tips channel. You know, I don't love everything they do anyway, because, you know, a lot of it is just infomercials and stuff like that. But as far as Linux coverage on Linus Tech Tips, easily the best video they've ever done. So I do want to give props when it is due. Good job, Linus Tech Tips, giving Linux the proper coverage it so deserves. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, Douglas, Dylan, Leo, Rob, Robert, and Tony. They are the producers of the show. They're my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without them, taking into account episode 37 would not have been possible. The show is also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen, all those names you see on the screen. They help support my work over on Patreon. Again, without them, this show would not be possible. If you'd like to consider supporting the channel, please do so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. All right, guys. Peace.